Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us.
Hello, I'm Paul Louis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, and welcome to New Wine Tastings, where we seek to be stretched in light of the new wine of Jesus' kingdom and what he calls us to as the new wineskins of his community. And it's my privilege today to introduce to you three distinguished guests working within the multi-ethnic church movement. And the title of this talk today is The Multi-Ethnic Church Movement, Past, Present, and Future. My guests are Oneya Okuwobi and Mark Damas. I always have a hard time with the name Mark. So Mark Damas, and it's not because my name's Paul or anything like that. And, he's closer to Barnabas, but, and then also Michael Emerson. And these are figures working as catalysts in the multi-ethnic church movement. And you may know of their work. You're going to know more about their work today. And just at such a critical time in our society, both here and abroad, really, when we think about racial justice, racial equity, injustice, trauma, some would call it, in certain respects, fatigue. Wherever you're coming from on the cultural spectrum, this is really a talk to help the church grow into this reality. And these are leaders who are going to help lead the way for us on this subject of how the church really lives into the reality when Jesus said in his high priestly prayer, John 17, what some call the true Lord's Prayer, may they be one, Father, as we are one, to let the world know that you sent your Son. This is their heartbeat. This is their passion. And so I'm going to introduce them now. Oneya Okuwobi is a sociologist and a Ph.D. candidate at the Ohio State University. And she's already been publishing in this domain of what we're talking about today with equity matters and unity and diversity. Michael Emerson, who's professor and head in the Department of Sociology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And we'll have opportunity to talk about some of his work. Some of you may be very familiar with the book Divided by Faith that he co-authored with Christian Smith. And then Mark Damas, who is the founding pastor of the Mosaic Church of Central Arkansas, as well as co-founder, CEO, president of the Mosaics Global Network. And some of you may attend the conferences. They have a lot of offerings, both on the national and local levels. And so all of these are authors working in various domains, and you've probably read their work at Christianity Today and in broader publications. So Mark, we're gonna start with you as the founder of the Mosaics Global Network. How would you define a multi-ethnic church for our viewers? I think that's just important at the get-go if someone hasn't really come upon this in the past. And here I'm thinking about distinctive traits, values, and percentages, as in percentage of congregants of diverse ethnic backgrounds, as well as staff leadership. What's that percentage in a congregation where it really truly becomes multi-ethnic? I know it goes deeper than that, but let's just start there. Mark Damas.
Well, if we start there, we really should start with Michael, because obviously the great work that Mark Chavez, those guys have done, that Michael's done over 20 years, it really starts probably with that 20% diversity measure that Michael first put forth and that they used in the statistics over the past 20 years. And then maybe we could start there, Michael. I don't want to redirect, but I'm saying that when you talk about percentages, I think that kind of starts there for me. And then, of course, over time, as Michael's talked about, even the maturity of the movement, you begin to see that as kind of the baseline, but there's so much more to it than that. So maybe Michael could get started on that. And then meanwhile, I can, because we did put out a more robust or mature definition in 2018. In fact, Oneya helped work on that along with a couple other colleagues. And maybe I could present that after Michael kind of talks first about the definition from 20 years ago and where we're at in the research in that regard. So what do you think, Michael?
Let's do it. So, and I'm really glad we're going to get to your updated definition. So when we started, we did just make it demographic diversity. So a very simple measure. 20% or more of a congregation is not the majority. So no more than 80% is the majority group. Why? Two reasons. One is entirely statistical, which is the chances of people coming in contact with someone different than themselves racially at 20% is actually 99%. It's a very high percent. And then the other is, and we find this in organization after organization, institution after institution, is that the 20% allows, it's like a trigger point at which you switch, a switch point from going to tokenism, to actually being able to have a collective voice. It doesn't always work that way, but we find across business and all kinds of institutions that seems to be the magic marker. Now, Mark is going to elaborate there, because part of the problem, what we'll talk about today, is that's the initial marker, but sometimes we're finding in our research that's the only marker people think they need to do.
Yeah, and I've always said through the years, obviously, So Grounded and Divided by Birth, a really literally groundbreaking book that, in my opinion, really launches a true movement. You know, it's a starting point, not a stopping point, just like Acts chapter 2. So often people get hung up on Jerusalem as if it's the end-all be-all church of the New Testament, when really Luke's telling a story and the starting point is Jerusalem. I mean, you're, in our opinion, my opinion, Antioch at Acts 11 and Acts 13 and into 16 with economic diversity, it's a flowering, it's a maturing. So again, with that context, you know, I think over time, as I began from a practical standpoint and as a pastor and interacting with many other pastor denominations over time, I was finding that people were, you know, kind of saying, hey, we're finally a multiracial church. You know, we finally made it. We crossed 20% diversity, as if that was the end, right? And that happens so often through the years. And then particularly as the movement and the growth and understanding or perspectives began to grow, and people began to challenge the movement a little bit and begin and question it and critique it. Often I found it was centered on that definition, right? And so over time, then that's where I got to thinking again. Oneya, Santis Beatty from the Wesleyan denomination, a few others. We began to work in like 2017, 2018, and just started to throw. Hey, if we were to move beyond that, and again, I love what Michael said at our conference in 2019, just this maturing of the movement, what would be a more robust and mature definition that would seem to encompass as many as possible in a short, concise definition, elements of what would make what I have been calling since my first book in 2007, a healthy multi-ethnic church. So when I use the word healthy, I'm talking about structural diversity, shared equity, justice, all that's robust in that. And of course, that's how I was using the term healthy in 2007. So here's the definition. I'll just read it. Recently, I was asked by Christianity to respond to some research. So we put this out there just even recently in Christianity Today, but we said a healthy multi-ethnic church is one in which people of diverse ethnic and economic backgrounds will themselves, right? So part of that definition is you're going to will yourself to this. But first, to walk, work, and worship God together as one, to advance a credible witness of God's love for all people. Secondly, that to recognize, renew, reconcile, and redeem broken relationships, both interpersonal and collective. So there's that aspect of reconciliation, of redemption, renewal, even repentance could be part of that. Third, establish equitable systems of responsible authority, leadership, governance, and accountability within the congregation. So again, getting at some of the structural aspects of equity. Advocate and advance justice, mercy, and compassion work in the community, in part helping people to understand that justice is not peripheral to the gospel or to a multi-ethnic church, but it's intrinsic to the gospel. Therefore, it should be intrinsic to the church. And lastly, to embrace the tension of sound theological reflection and applicational relevance in an increasingly complex and intersectional society for the sake of the gospel. So recognizing that there's a tension in our theological reflection and then how we apply that in this diverse context, in a changing context, and that there's a tension that in a sense gets embraced. It's not either you are that or you're not that. There's a tension you live in, there's a tension you embrace, And we just got to be honest about that, as opposed to trying to relieve that tension. It's rather, no, we actually embrace it and lean into it. And then we just work it out, in the things, and try to come to the happy medium, so to speak, in terms of our practical application of this in a local church context.
And to the viewers, questions they might have, how do we access that? In a blog post that will accompany this video, and hopefully in the subtext with the video at our YouTube channel, we'll include the link, and it'll also be at a blog post as part of one of the links related to this interview at Patheos. So more coming that way at Uncommon God, Common Good at Patheos. So Mark, thanks so much. And as we transition back to Michael, and then we're going to go then to Oneya in a few minutes. Mark has been talking a lot about structures, and one of the key points coming out of the book Divided by Faith was that evangelicals are often very focused on individual personal relationships, but are anti-structural in engagement. And that really impacts us negatively historically at dealing with racialization, how race impacts everything from healthcare, education, to where we live, et cetera, all down the line. And so Mark was emphasizing that over and over again. That's something our other colleagues are going to be discussing as well. So transitioning there, Michael, you and Mark were there at the outset, so to speak, within the evangelical multi-ethnic movement, which was about 20 years ago, as far as my understanding. And so you've been at this for a long time. I'm not going to say how old you are, but you've been at it a long time. You have called for stepping back, Michael, at the last conference that Mark hosted, and looking at the big picture to see the gains made, the pressing challenges, and the need for the multi-ethnic church movement to grow not simply from toddlers to teenagers, that was your language, I believe, but also to full adulthood. And you've alluded to it. You already alluded to it a bit, and Mark did as well, that it's the 20% is just the starting point. That's just getting going. It's not the end game. So please unpack this big picture of moving toward adulthood in terms of some of the challenges, the gains, needed future growth in light of your research post Divided by Faith, Michael.
Yeah, I'll use two images. So one, if you think of an onion and you peel away a layer, what do you find? Another layer, and then another layer, and another layer. Even 20 years ago, we knew if we're going to move towards multi-ethnic, multiracial churches, it's going to be like peeling an onion. But you've got to make sure you get that first layer first. And that first layer is, we got to get together in churches. It's going to be messy, and it's going to be all kinds of pain and turmoil. But until we get to that point, we can't even deal with those kind of issues. They won't even seem real. So that was step one. And that is what I talk about when I say toddlers. We're wobbling around, we're stumbling, we're making mistakes, we're burning our hands, we're falling over. But at least we have life, and we are in the process of growing. So, even in the definition Mark just offered, I mean, that's a maturing, that is a major maturation of understanding what is a multi-ethnic church. And that's where we need to get to. The risk, of course, is that people in the difficulty and some of the stuff that I know Oneya is going to talk about as well, and we find lots of difficulties in our research. The risk is that people will give up, and we got to ask people. The best advice I've ever gotten from a person of color was stay at the table. As a white person, it's so easy just to say, had enough, walk away. For anybody, really. Stay at the table. If this is God's calling, then let it be tough. That's fine. We'll just keep relying on God to show us the next step as we grow.
Thank you, Michael. And when you think about precedent in this regard, Mark had already mentioned the first chapters of Acts, Acts 1:8, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth. Think of Acts 15. And of course, that's more of a covenant dynamic, as J. Cameron Carter has talked about, with Jews as a covenant community. I mean, Abram was a Gentile made into a Jew, so to speak, but you have a precursor to what we're talking about here with Jews and Gentiles, because talk about, this idea of Jews and Gentiles being brought together. I mean, What about homogeneity there? There's no homogeneity. Talk about being stretched over the discussion of faith and circumcision. And that was a messy conversation, but so critical, so catalytic. One of the most important chapters in the whole of the New Testament, Acts 15, of the Jerusalem Council. And it didn't get easier from that point. In some ways, it even got harder. But it was important because it was God's call and God's vision for the church and his kingdom. And so, Oneya, we're going to transition at that point, unless Michael wanted to add something further. We're going to transition at this point. And in terms of your own research as a sociologist of religion, you have argued, and I found this a fascinating statement at your own website, and there will be a link to it. Like you had said, when multiracial organizations mask racial inequality, they may reify stratification instead of remedying it. And I thought that was an amazingly important point that goes further and takes it even deeper in terms of what we're after today. Could you unpack that, please, for us?
Sure, I'd love to. You know, it gets at a bit of what Michael was saying, this idea that multiracial, multi-ethnic organizations, churches are necessary, but emphasizing the fact that they're still not sufficient. That's not the end of the road, that's the beginning of the road. And the reason why that argument is so important is because diversity is generally viewed as positive. People tend to have a good reaction to it, even while recognizing some of those liabilities. And that's part of what makes multiracial churches and multi-ethnic churches increasingly popular. But that positivity also tends to make diversity the solution to any of our race problems. But when you look at it today, the primary problem of race is not segregation, even though that still exists and causes problems in our education system, in our neighborhoods, etc. The primary problem is not that we're not respecting each other's cultures, even though we've got a long way to go in that. The primary problem is persistent inequality. These differences that give whites a better social, economic, and political racial contract than non-whites. And so if you apply the solution of diversity, you've got a good prescription, but it's not the right prescription for the problem. And so as people come together in multiracial, multi-ethnic congregations, they tend to forget that the people who they're sitting in the pews next to may be living a very different life outside of those pews than what they see as they come together on a Sunday morning. To add to that, most of our churches are not talking about persistent and structural racial inequality. So that even gives congregants more of a reason to say, I go to church with all of these different sorts of people, but I've never heard of these problems. And therefore, these problems must not exist. I've been part of a research project that's led by Dr. Corey Little Edwards called the Religious Leadership and Diversity Project. And that was the largest project of its time, where we interviewed 121 pastors of multiracial churches all over the country. And we found that only about 40% of pastors could even conceptualize racial inequality as structural. So these
those
are
were
people
multi-ethnic. I'm sorry, those were multi-ethnic churches.
Multi-ethnic churches, wow. The people leading these churches, not just the congregants. And you only got up to 40% of people who could actually understand that racial inequality was structural.
That's
and
staggering.
40%, all of them weren't even talking about it on a regular basis due to pushback from their congregants or didn't talk about it that way consistently. So you've got people coming together, but then you have a very small percentage of these leaders, pastors, churches talking about the real issues of race that continue to persist. And when people don't think that there's a problem, they fight against solutions to it. That's the sort of thinking that turns affirmative action into reverse racism, for example. If you don't think that people of color are really being discriminated against, then why solve that? And so that's why I say that multiracial organizations can reify this racial inequality, this racial stratification, because when people come together and they're not being told that there's still a problem, and they're not seeing that there's still a problem, they think that there's not a problem.
Mm-hmm. Sobering, and it just shows how many layers to the onion there really are.
It's a large onion, or parfait.
Yeah, And I tend to cry when I'm peeling an onion anyway, so this just makes it, what a bad vegetable. So anyway, that being said, or that said, one of the things we're going to get to later is, again, Michael, you and Christian Smith have talked about this, that we tend to think with racialization that it functions more by way of constants rather than variables, and that it's evolving. That's your point, right? It's evolving. We think it's static. What you just said, Oneya, it just shows how evolving it is. And so we can reify in multi-ethnic churches where it can become even more of a problem, because the more we think we've solved it and we don't want the problem, we think we've solved it, the more reinforced, reified it becomes. So that is really a challenge. And I think a lot of churches out my way are really passionate about, confessing right now in light of the George Floyd death, of not being connected. And I appreciate the goodwill and the spirit behind that, and one should never fault that. But my fear is if this is a market-driven reality, if it's like we may lose our millennials or our Gen Zers because they're passionate about justice. Well, if that gets reified more and more, they might just stop talking about it and go back to business as usual. It's got to be a kingdom foundation stone, which is something Mark DeMaz talks a lot about, that we need to make sure there's a biblical basis, a theological basis, and it's not simply a church growth technique, because that won't sustain it. I think, Mark, you would agree with that now as much as you've always agreed you've always said that. And I want to transition, Mark, and you can respond to that if you like, but I'd like to transition to you at this juncture. You've shared with me and with viewers generally that recent analyses of the multi-ethnic church movement have not gone far enough to address the complexities, including the gains. A lot has come out in the last few years about some of the obstacles, the discouragements, maybe setbacks is a good word, but you stated that unfortunately they haven't accounted for the positives. The cup is not really half empty, it's half full, you've argued in different contexts. Could you develop for our viewers what you mean by, and our listeners, half empty, half full, and how you really think, and they'll have access to some of the NPR, New York Times, other types of studies, articles that have come out when they see the blog and the YouTube video. Develop this imagery, the metaphors, and how it bears on your critical and constructive assessment, Mark, of recent analyses of the multi-ethnic church movement, please.
Yeah, sure, you bet. Real quick, speaking of analogies, Michael used the metaphor of an onion. My colleague Harriet Lee and I here in Little Rock have often thought about an analogy in terms of the complexities and even the things that Oneya was sharing, and about like an ocean. Some people go to the ocean and they stand on the beach and they go, oh man, it was awesome. I really enjoyed the ocean today, and then somebody else, they go in and they get up to ankle deep in the water and they go, oh yeah, it was awesome. I really enjoyed, we were, kicking around and looking for seashells. And then, you just play it out, right? Somebody else is out there riding, body surfing. Somebody else is surfing on a surfboard, riding 20-foot waves. Then further out, there's people, they're scuba diving, they're down 100 feet or whatever. And in a sense, even though you might be a scuba diver, there's still 100 miles of ocean in front of you, and it goes 100 miles deep. Like just because you've been to the moon doesn't mean we understand the universe. And I think, just pivoting back to this just for a second, I look at this, and I wrote about this in 2010. I believe we need to think about the development of healthy, multi-ethnic, economically diverse, socially just ministry, local churches, as corporate sanctification. In other words, just like the individual, we know where we're going biblically, right? I don't know how it's going to happen, but I'm theoretically, I get saved, I get justified, I'm moving towards becoming more holy as God gives me breath. Often it's taught like an escalator, but anybody who's lived long enough with Christ knows it's more of a roller coaster than it is an escalator to sanctification. But the point is, the end game, someday I die and I'm transformed. I become the perfect Mark DeMaz. I'm not Jesus, I'll never be God, but I am completed in Christ, and all my sin is away. Well, we know that's true for the individual and we teach it, but we ought to be, in my opinion, thinking about this journey as a journey of corporate sanctification as well, right? So we know the end game for the body of Christ, Revelation 7:9, every nation, tribe, people, and tongue, that heaven is just, it's equitable, on we could go. So why would some churches say, well, that's just who we are, like as if that they can't grow. So the idea is to be from season to season, moving our churches forward in regards to this vision of Revelation 7:9, kingdom of God on earth as in heaven, but even knowing you'll never get there because that ocean is deep and vast, and you can explore it, but you'll just never get there. And we got to keep going and persist in that and learn and all that. Now, having said that, what I was responding to, and in part, obviously, Oneya, Michael, you guys super sharp. You, Paul, too. You're kind of a cross theologian and sociologist. I'm in the practical side, right? I'm the pastor. I'm pastoring a church and I'm working with pastors on the ground. I'm kind of in a role of a cheerleader. I didn't ask to be in that role, but because it is very difficult. And as someone already alluded to, it's just so easy to flame out, to just go out. I don't want to do this anymore. So often I'm trying to keep people's spirits up, right? I have to keep my own spirits up. Going back 20 years, Oneya's former pastor, Chris Beard, we used to commiserate, like, are we the only two people in America thinking it? Because everybody else is telling us we're crazy. So kind of built into my whole journey over 20 years has been this need first for myself to encourage and to keep my eyes on that North Star and keep going, and then for others. So in terms of the recent research and when the 20% multiracial, and I asked Oneya about this before Ed Stetzer asked me to write a response in Christianity Today. The research is excellent. Again, I'm not a sociologist, but I don't have any challenge to the validity of the research, the extensiveness, and what they pull out, and particularly where pain's related, pain and problem that experienced by people of color, and particularly African Americans, going to these churches that bill themselves, if you will, as multi-ethnic, multiracial, and getting there, and all they've got is a 20%. They don't have the structures right. They're not talking about, as Oneya said. And then there's that sense of pain and burn, and I tried that, and that's not what it is. So I don't doubt any of that at all, and I hate that. And all along, like you said, from a theological perspective, myself and others and everybody I have a chance to work with, we're always trying to champion. No, hang in. That's not what it is. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a healthy church, and structural diversity, et cetera. So again, a lot of that cheerleading and championing and saying, no, that's not what it is. Don't give up on it. Keep going. And here's what we can get to. But this is my thing. I wish Michael or Oneya or Corey or any of them, maybe another study in time could be done. Because this is what theoretically, if you go to a church that is defined as multiracial based on the 80-20 rule, if you will, okay? And for just talking sake, let's say that's the low bar, and there's a good number of churches, certainly tons more now than 20 years ago, that meet that initial entry piece. And you go and you interview, whether it's pastors or parishioners or what have you, you're going to probably hear, and this is an assumption, I could be totally wrong, and y'all that are smarter than me, please tell me. This is what I've been thinking about it though, is that you're likely to get more stories of pain and problem if that is it, at 80-20 in the versus if you were able to go to churches that are further down the road in terms of their understanding, in terms of their maturity. Theoretically, even the definition that we put forth, who could ever hit that perfectly, right? It's just like saying that's the North Star. We're trying to get there. We're trying to move there. And as Oneya said, we're always having this. You don't just get there. You got to stay there and maintain that and grow and all that. So my thought is, here's my only thought, just to summarize, is that it seems to me if you were going to churches that weren't just 80-20, if you will, but actually were further down the road in terms of that mature definition, my hypothesis is you may not find as much of the pain and problematic issues that have been raised, because you're interviewing and you're talking to churches that are more specifically mature. And I'm not saying they weren't involved in the studies. I don't know who's involved in the study. I'm sure there's some that are like that and some that aren't. But again, if the definition is mere 20% diversity in the pews, that's that, you know, I think you can go beyond that, and you'd find, I know Oneya is a part of our church for a year in Dale. And again, no perfect church because there's no perfect people, no perfect pastors. But I think Oneya would say what she saw in our church, yeah, there's problems, there's issues, but there's also a lot that's working well, and potentially further down the road than another church that may have just got to 20% diversity and say, that's it, we're done. We got there, it's over, right? So anyway, that's just some of the thoughts related to how I'm trying to do. But at the end of the day, it's trying to champion this idea that, yeah, I love what Michael said. It's really that idea of maturity, right? But I think there's a lot of people in the last 5 years that are, in a sense, new to the dance. Mm-hmm. Okay. And they haven't taken the time, or they don't know the history. And so they come in with a snapshot at this moment, and they say, for instance, white people won't follow people of color. Well, I know that's true. That's been true historically. It's very true still today, but it's changing. But Michael, you know the stat, I can't remember it exactly, but I know that today, according to the latest research, 17%, if I remember right, of these churches are led by people of color, whereas maybe 20 years ago, what, Michael, was maybe 4% or something like that, or 6%. I don't remember what the number is, but the point is, if you look at that right now in the absence of context, and you say only 17% of churches are led by people of color, as if that's a problem, well, that's kind of looking at the glass half empty. But if you recognize that 20 years ago, and again, Michael can correct the number, but where things were 10 years ago or 15 years ago in that regard, and even the drop in white people who are leading those churches down from roughly, 88% to 70 something or whatever. So those numbers, in a sense, are going in the right direction. But if you don't know the trajectory of the past, and you just look at it in this moment, you could see the glass, again, half empty, when you're saying, no, look how far we've come. And yes, there's still far to go, but see the positive. So it takes that tension, I think, of the research and reminding people of pain. And we've got to go along with the cheerleaders and champions. And they're not competitive in my mind at all. It's bringing that tension and that balance to keep pushing this thing forward. Because at the end of the day, we're all going to get there. It's Revelation 7:9. So whether you like it on earth or not, you're going there. Okay, so we might as well get on board and try to move this thing down the track.
Amen. And Michael, were you going to add something to that?
Yeah, if I could. So we're actually been doing a big national study the last couple of years on race and religion, and right now we're finalizing a monograph with the Barna Research Group, and this is to pick up on Mark's point. What we realize is what we need in this monograph, and we're working on, is we need exemplars. What are multiracial congregations, multi-ethnic congregations that have been doing it for a while, that are further down the road, just as Mark said? We need to hold those out as models for people and show them how it goes much beyond the diversity, and that there actually are some of these.
Yeah, I'll look forward to, when is that, look forward to that. When is that due out? Do you have an idea?
I think it's supposed to come out September.
So through the Barna Group.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Oneya, did you want to add anything to that?
I think I would just say, I do agree, Mark, on so many points. And I also, though, don't want people to think, though, that time does solve these issues. Because I think, as you would say, Mark, we've been living out the gospel for over 2,000 years, but there still needed to be a Mark DeMoss to bring out the fact that the gospel included racial reconciliation and bringing people from all backgrounds together. And so as churches are coming into reaching the 80-20, needing to be intentional about recognizing what really is the goal and moving forward, and not just continuing to do the same things that they've done year in, year out, like you said, not thinking that that's an end point, but recognizing, okay, where do we still have work to do? Because in the absence of that, time, we found, doesn't really make the difference. It's what's the intentionality and what is the goal of the church over the long run.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. To take intentional steps, right? The second of 7 core commitments. And I think, without maybe diving deep is important, because I love this conversation. It's great when we all get together. I was reflecting on this when you both were talking earlier, Michael and Oneya, about one of the problems is likely, again, hypothesis, but none of us were taught this in seminary or Bible college. So you think about like when you were talking, Oneya, about 40% of pastors or whatever, 60% aren't even talking about these things, because what they're talking about is what they learned in seminary in terms of what is the gospel, what is the church, what in their particular denomination or network defines what is a successful or effective church. And as you and I both know, we talk about this, it's the whole gospel, not just Romans 1:16a, but also 1:16b in the whole book. So I think part of that problem is probably they don't know what else to do. They don't know what else to say. And so so obviously getting to the Bible colleges, the seminaries, we have a degree at Wheaton now. Paul, of course, your great work at Multnomah. The more we can get that to begin teaching these pastors that they're coming out and affect the denominations and networks in terms of what is North Star. And because that's probably, I'm just guessing again, but probably a lot of the problem is they don't know what to say other than the standard party line of let's preach Jesus and be all about the gospel and see souls saved. And yeah, I'm all about, that's why we do what we do. But as you've already talked about, and so I think they just default back to what they know. And especially when you're in a position as a leader and people are looking up to you and you're in a sense supposed to know what you're doing. And then in this area, you don't know anything because number one, you haven't lived it, you haven't been taught it, you haven't thought deeply about it, you haven't, you're not living a multi-ethnic life, if you will. I think that probably all contributes to some of the things you've found in your research and writing, Oneya.
And I think for our viewers and listeners, as you hear Oneya and Mark and Michael share, you sense a desire to guard against hype, that they do acknowledge that there are challenges and we have a long way to go. We're in the ocean water, but we're still waiting, right? And we're the North Star is ahead, right? I'm just playing off these metaphors. I love them. I don't think I've had more metaphors in one interview so far. New Wineskins. I'm kind of like in heaven already. I love metaphors. My life's a metaphor. It's a dead metaphor.
Don't forget, as you're going through the ocean, you're carrying an onion.
Right. Yeah, it's a dead metaphor. I hate to say my life is, but
and trying to find the North Star while you navigate. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Yeah. I'm sipping on that onion juice. It's just like, it's wow. This is half full, half empty. But no, seriously, you find with what my colleagues are saying here is they're guarding against hype, but they also have hope, and there's a hunger. Mm-hmm. There's hunger. They haven't lost the hunger. They realize if we stagnate, if we sit back, if we rest, it just, a sociologist religion here will tell us that we'll just kind of go cater with the force of gravity of what we're normatively framed by in terms of our homogeneity and such. Just we need to keep pressing. And I love this. I love this conversation, what you're hearing, as there's a sharpening going on. As one of the founders of the Navigators, Leroy Imes, said, iron sharpens iron, cream puffs don't sharpen cream puffs. And so you sense here with Proverbs 27:17, just a real desire to continue to stretch, to be drawn into this with that North Star ahead. So thank you all for that rich reflection you just shared. So Michael, you were quoted in the New York Times article, which I had alluded to earlier, but it's titled, "The Quiet Exodus, Why Black Worshipers Are Leaving White Evangelical Churches," as saying that the presidential election of 2016 has had a huge impact, or did have a huge impact, on the decrease of African-American attendees, members in multi-ethnic churches. And here's the exact quote: "Everything we tried is not working," said Michael Emerson, the author of Divided by Faith, a seminal work on race relations within the evangelical church. Emerson goes on, "The election itself was the single most harmful event to the whole movement of reconciliation in at least the past 30 years. He said it's about to completely break apart." Well, that's a staggering statement back in when it was first printed, if you will. Could you edit and or expand on that statement, Michael, that's been attributed to you? And further, for all the great gains generally involving other ethnicities, the initial boom in terms of African-American inclusion has taken a downward turn within evangelicalism. I think you had articulated that. I think Mark has articulated that. We have to take note of that. That's that reification, perhaps in some ways, and other things that were stated. You've been quoted elsewhere as saying that there is some exodus, that's your language, some exodus, which needs to be noted and addressed. And so taking it to you here, Michael, bringing it to you here for your reflections. In your estimation, what in particular has led to this partial, not full, partial exodus after initial great gains in inclusion of African Americans? And lastly, given your and Christian Smith's work on how racialization proceeds by way of variables rather than constants, what variables, what perhaps new variables, Michael, are you seeing in place or in play today?
Three-part question. So if I forget, just feel free to remind me. So let me start with the New York Times and that quote, which was, I think the part that captures people's attention is the election was the single most destructive thing to reconciliation in the last 30 years. Is that, I'm not giving my opinion there. I think it comes across as that. What I'm doing is when I'm talking to the reporter, I'm saying, as I have been doing interviews across the country with leaders of color within this movement, they have told me this was the thing that has broken their back. We heard that a lot. We know there's complexity. I mean, we live in a funny system where we only get two choices. And if you actually make a third choice, people say you're throwing your vote away. I lived for a while in a European country where you have 8 choices. And everybody gets a proportional. So if you get 10% of the vote, you get 10% representation in the government. So it's not an either or as it is here. So we know that it's an impossible thing to, anybody you vote for, as my son says, I'm going to go and vote. And then when I come home, I'm going to take a shower because I always am voting for somebody who believes in some things I don't. So I'm all of that to say, I'm not trying to say politics here. I'm trying to say that leaders of color, and particularly African Americans, said that hurt them so deeply. And the reason it hurt was you had such a high percent of white evangelicals voting for one candidate who in their minds is overtly racist, willing to say things that people might think, but he actually says them. And I'll give you an example. So when that election happened in my multiracial church, oh my word, it was, I mean, there was weeping among the African Americans in particular in our congregation, and fear, like what's going to happen to us? And for the white folks, it's like, wow, it's just an election. There'll be another one if you don't like the result. Yeah, so that's where that quote is coming from. It just over and over again in interviews, hearing that. What was the second part of the question?
Okay, so the second part of the question was, what in particular has led to this partial exodus after initial great gains and inclusion of African Americans? Because you said partial in your more recent statement, may have been at the Mosaics conference in 2019, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so there has been some. So there was this upward trajectory and it leveled off and has gone down slightly. And we'll have to track it over time to see if it comes back or, levels off again. But it's exactly that. It's that breaking point, which I'll give you, I'm not going to say who, but a very influential reconciliation leader saying, I thought if I could, I believe my white brothers and sisters when they said they cared about me.
Michael, we're going to come back to that.
Believe that.
Michael, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
As we studied the Bible together,
Michael, sorry. There was a little catch there, and I'm going to have to ask you to repeat that. I don't know if that was sabotage somewhere through the internet or what, that you wouldn't mention names, and all of a sudden we had a surge. So do you mind repeating? Someone said, you won't mention the name.
Yeah, said that the election was the breaking point, and said I'm done with, this is a person who's written books on reconciliation. I'm done with it. I am so hurt. What I learned in this, and this is, again, this is this person's perspective, but that white Christians are willing to put their whiteness ahead of their Christianity. their Christianity being unity of all brothers and sisters who are Christian. It felt like they had been rejected, put in second place, and that no matter what the Bible might say, they weren't willing to follow it. So I think that illustrates some of why we see some exodus. Of course, not everyone thinks that. Otherwise, we would have a total exodus, and we don't have anything like that.
It caught again there for a second, but otherwise we'd have a total exodus, but nothing of the sort has occurred. It's just that we need to account for a dip or a lack of retention in some respects. And then it caught again. Was there something else you wanted to say?
No, just that's exactly why there's been some exodus, but not anything near complete exodus.
Mm-hmm. And even that conversation, like in your multi-ethnic church, or when we think of police shootings of African-American men, I remember my multi-ethnic church in North Portland, I could hear African-American men just breathing as we were grieving over the loss of an African-American's life. I won't forget that. But when it's not talked about from the pulpit, or there's no prayer about that, that's so heavy to many in the African-American community. I think for a white person like myself, back to the point that all three of you are making, I need to be willing to hear that. I need to put myself in a position, at the very least, and I don't mean this to soft pedal it, but empathy is not the same as sympathy to me. Empathy is really identifying with someone heart to heart, life and life, sharing story. And I need to be able to process that point, regardless of one's politics, because people are just shut down at that point. Am I willing to listen to the critique? Am I willing to live in that angst, or am I going to pull out? That's the concern, one of the concerns I have as we go, because things are so much confirmation bias for all of us in certain respects. Am I willing to live into that? And then, Michael, there was another question. What are the variables you see in light of your book, variables that are in play today? Maybe it's a new variable that when you wrote it in 2001, when it was published with Oxford in 2001, you didn't have this variable in play. What is a new variable, perhaps, that we're seeing occur in this context that you alluded to? That was in terms of
the multiracial churches, or in terms of race relations in general?
With this dynamic of it was the upswing and now there is a dip. Is there a variable there that we need to account for? Because it's not slavery, it's not chattel slavery, it's not Jim Crow, it's not civil rights, it's not post-civil rights. What is this?
Yeah, I'll let others add. We call this kind of era that always we're disenfranchising people of color. So the era now is mass incarceration. Once you've got a prison record, you're not a citizen in a way, in so many ways. Your life is miserable.
Michelle Alexander's book.
Michelle Alexander's book, New Jim Crow. When They See Us, if you ever watch that, you'll get a sense of the way your life gets destroyed by it. So that's kind of the era we're in, which is disenfranchising in a new way. And that's something 20 years ago I wasn't seeing. And that's clearly what is happening now. So we were in what we call the colorblind era, but I think we're transitioning out of that. The colorblind era, meaning we don't see race. I think we see race pretty clearly now, but we are finding ways to do what we've always done, which is some groups we say are better and some groups are not. I think of Daniel Hill's book, Wide Awake, Pastor Daniel Hill. He basically, he opens it with a really interesting line. He's at a wedding. He's talking to his friend who's getting married. He's from India. And he says, "It's so awesome to see your culture. I wish I had a culture." And his friend says to him, "Not only do you have a culture, but anytime your culture comes in contact with any other culture, you always win." And Daniel Hill said, "I just couldn't get out of my head. I was offended. I was so confused. I don't have a culture. I'm just an American." I think we're coming to a realization that, and Oneya can talk about this too, but a new variable is that we are actually seeing what you would say denormalizing whiteness, the sense that white is American, that there's actually different varieties, different ways to be American, different practices of being Christian. I think that's the next step we're at.
And maybe we'll have a chance for Oneya to share more about that disenfranchisement, but it's like the new Jim Crow, that people really are excluded, even though they're really not there in terms of being able to be a part of the everyday life and full access and belonging. And Oneya, it is not enough to be about racial reconciliation. There was an article that Mark highlighted for me where a lot of white evangelicals like the language of, racial reconciliation. As we know, there's been a pushback even on justice, like social justice. And I don't think people realize history. If we don't understand history, we tend to repeat it. That's exactly what happened during the Scopes trial era with social gospel, the language of social gospel. Now it's social justice. Some of the same patterns are there. So they will talk about racial reconciliation, but a lot of white evangelicals are wary of talking about racial justice or social justice, racial social justice and equity. Well, that certainly includes diversity of leadership in churches, including African American leadership in increasing measure. There must be more than that, it seems to me. And I think a recent study you did with one of the journals, with Sociology of Religion, Oxford published journal, you were thinking through this, I believe, and please tell me if I'm wrong, but how does this discussion bear upon racial equity? And I just want to unpack that a little bit more, and then please respond. Organizations, including multi-ethnic churches, could or will often experience certain benefits for such diversification. I don't think it's just businesses. Churches are businesses too, nonprofits, however you want to look at it. They could experience certain benefits. However, that does not safeguard or ensure the equal or equitable distribution of those resources. Would you agree with these statements? And if that is so, how do we move forward with greater intentionality to ensure equal or better equitable distribution to fill the glass and lead the multi-ethnic church movement to adulthood? To play off these metaphors, some of the metaphors, as we go toward the North Star. Okay, I added that one too. We're in the ocean water. We're in the ocean water. Okay.
Keep them all in. Keep them all in. I'm gonna run with the metaphor, because to me, it's not so much whether the glass is half full or half empty. It's really about the circumstances by which that amount of liquid came to be in the glass. I think about Christmas time, and we would always get a bottle of sparkling cider, and however many of us would have that much equal sparkling cider. So nowhere near a full cup, but we're all enjoying the same amount together as a family. That's the kind of glass that we want to have. And that at that point we can say, yeah, it's half full at this point, but we're going to keep working together. We've got the same amount. Very different situation though, if I drink half of a full glass and I give you the rest of it and say, okay, now we're in a half full, half empty situation. I don't want what's left over. I want us all to have the same. And that is, for me, just paints the picture of what we need to start thinking about to be equitable within multiracial churches. Right now, we do have a situation where the benefits of diversification are disproportionately given to white folks and white institutions, white organizations, denomination or churches that are embedded within white denominations. All of these groups are better able to market, to gain additional members, to have a better notoriety or better status as a result of having a diverse congregation than those benefits being accrued to people of color. So what we see is, white people in institutions getting these benefits. What I'm seeing in my recent research, and I'm in the middle of a research study right now where I'm interviewing employees of multiracial, diverse churches, universities, and workplaces, and employees of color. And I'm seeing all of these costs. I'm seeing people giving up their identity. I'm seeing a loss of confidence. I'm seeing people suffering with health issues for walking into their multiracial churches day after day, year after year, and never being heard and never being seen. I'm seeing people being asked to be bridges for their organizations, which is all very well and good if everyone has an equal sacrifice, if everyone has an equally full glass. But if only one group is getting a more empty glass or the leftovers of the glass rather than others. And so in order for us to move forward, the benefits of diversification must be shared. And that means equal sacrifice on all parts. And oftentimes people just don't see the labor and the work that people of color are experiencing to be part of these spaces. The pain that Michael talked about earlier and the exodus are both very real. And people saying, I cannot subject myself to this anymore, physically, emotionally, or spiritually, or I'm not going to be able to continue to move forward. The second thing for me is that these leaders, this increasing leadership of leaders of color, they must be able to lead. Oftentimes people may be placed in a position of being the pastor of the church, but they may not have the power to make changes, the power to bring more equity, or even the resources to do so based on what denomination they might be in. And then, another thing for me is we have to get rid of these invitations to the table. Another metaphor, sorry about that, but
I'm loving it. I love these metaphors.
When we have in the past said we want to invite more people of color to the table, that means that table is already set up. It's a table that has a foundation that is based on whiteness, and even symbolic changes to the table don't really change the table. How dedicated are we as a group to dismantling the whole table and saying, I'm not going to sit at a table until we can build this table together? And then finally, in terms of issues of equity, having a broader recognition of the issues that cause inequity. So having a race conversation and ignoring gender means that you're going to ignore half of the people of color. And so at our church, and I'm also a practitioner in addition to being a sociologist, we like to focus on love and unity. This idea that we need self-sacrificial love for one another and unity among the body in a way that actively combats any form of bias that positions one person or group above another. We've made that our guiding principle so that we continue to live into and work into not just settling on being in the room together, but actually having this equity appear. Because, Mark is right. There's no room for giving up at this point in the journey. We do need to continue to be encouraged along the journey. But I know that at this point, the sacrifices, the very real pain is too inequitable for us to continue the way that we're going. And I do believe that there are better solutions that we're starting to see. And as Michael said, we need to continue to see those examples rising to the top.
Thank you, Oneya. And what Oneya, Okuwobi, and Mark DeMaz and Michael Emerson are sharing with us is available in a variety of contexts. And the Mosaics Global Network is a real center, a hub for where this conversation continues. We have a Portland chapter and a lot of chapters around the country and beyond. And then they have the national conferences. Please follow Oneya's work and Michael's and Mark's work. I'm going to give them an opportunity just to share closing thoughts in a minute. When Oneya says that, if we're inviting people to a table that's already been set, there really cannot be true belonging. And I think that's very painful. It's very hard for a church that wasn't multi-ethnic to begin with to become truly multi-ethnic in the way that our colleagues here are talking about. Doesn't mean it can't happen. There should never be hopelessness. It's just that it's going to take perhaps even more intentionality because the gravitas factor is so much in place. If we're starting a nonprofit, if we're starting an institute, if we're starting anything, we have to take on board Oneya's point front and center and never just say, here, have the leftovers of what's in my glass type of thing. And that's hard work, what Oneya is calling us to, but it's vital work. It is only possible too if we really keep in mind, and I'm not saying this flippantly, that North Star of Christ and his eschatological kingdom, his future kingdom that breaks into our present, that we live now in light of what will be, and that he is our hope, and he will make this church one. We are living into his reality, and we're going to live into that reality. We're going to keep pressing into it. Oneya and Michael and Mark, any closing thoughts for our viewers and our listeners today?
I'll start. So we have seen an incredible growth of multi-ethnic congregations in 20 years. Mosaics has played a huge part. Other groups have played a huge part. That transformation is something, again, I had mentioned this at their conference, that I didn't think would be possible to have that much change in 20 years. So that's hope. Even though we're stumbling, even though we sometimes make mistakes, that's hope. I'll tell you what my hope is. When I know we have really come somewhere is, when we do see some of these, when African Americans and other leaders of color are starting a church, they're the senior pastor, and white folks are there right alongside everyone else, that's an amazing sign. When people say we should have diversity in our congregation, and instead of, if they're a white congregation, saying, what can we do to get others here? They say, where can we go and worship? That would be amazing. That's the one thing we haven't yet seen at all. Zero evidence that that's happening. So what that says to me is we're still saying, even though we're not thinking this directly, our churches are better. We have things to offer rather than there's things we need that other people have, and we need to go and find that. Somehow our Christianity isn't full yet. So that's going to be a big change. And I'll just conclude with this, and you had mentioned this, we need to guard against hype, but we need to hold tight to hope.
Thank you, Michael. Oneya, Mark?
I think, I think what I would say is, having the opportunity to study not just churches, but workplaces, universities, military, etc., as a sociologist, no one's gotten it right yet. There's no institution that is living into this sort of equity, this very high call of love and unity that we've been talking about today that can be somewhat challenging. So we don't have a place where we see it yet. And the reason why I believe that is because Jesus gave that call to his church in John 17, as we talked about. We are supposed to be the ones who show it, who model it. And I feel like I have more and more evidence every year that we are the only ones who can do it. And so that's why we continue to show up and do this work, even when it looks hard, even when all of the data is going in the opposite direction, because I believe that Jesus wouldn't have prayed for something that was not possible. And so I want to see it in my lifetime. I'm going to keep working towards it. I know a lot of the folks listening will continue to do that too. So let's reclaim justice for what it is. It's God's word. It's not anybody else's. And let's challenge ourselves. Let's not stop short of what the real goal is, because we've achieved many things over the past years. Let's go all of the way so that we can be that example to every other institution of what it looks like to have equity.
I love
Amen.
it. I love
Amen.
it. Starting against that hype and living into that hope and the reality of Jesus Christ and this through the Spirit. So thank you, Oneya. That's powerful. Mark.
Well, just riffing off of Oneya, what she said again, I think, it's playing the long game, but not waiting on time alone to heal things, but recognizing it's a corporate journey, it's a sanctification journey, and we need to be able to be moving the ball down the field consistently. Like we're going 3 yards, 5 yards every season, just inching our way forward as a congregation on all these different things. Again, from kind of the practitioner side, and I can't even believe it, but I'm in my 20th year now, just crossed into the 20th year of Mosaic Church. And, it takes at any church, white, black, you name it, just to go 5 years, 10 years. The statistics are very difficult, and to have a reproducing church that actually is healthy, that has growth, that is bearing fruit. That's a difficult journey. I think we often take it for granted. And that's why so many churches, in a church plan, I think it's like 1/3 go out of business within 4 years, another 20% 2 years later. And then, so anyway, to make a long story short, to sustain this vision long-term, it does take that hunger. You have to understand, in a sense, it's calling. It's a calling. It's got to be rooted in your belly, between you and your interaction with the Lord, your interaction with the Word of God. And because that passion is what's going to keep you prayerful, patient, and persistent over time, because that's the only way this kind comes out. This kind only comes out through prayer and fasting. And what I'm saying about that is, what does that really mean? It means I'm going to be prayerful and patient and persistent over time. And that's rooted in my passion, my relationship with Christ, my understanding of the Word of God. And again, without knowing I'll never get there or congregationally, but certainly we ought to be able to show progress from epoch to epoch, from year to year. And as new questions come up, address them and deal with them. And so anyway, it's a journey. But I think in part saying that is that, again, when people just take a snapshot, and I'm not talking about researchers, but just on Twitter, for instance, and they have not thought deeply about these things, and they're otherwise just reading and reacting to things, there is the ideal, but then there's also what's realistic and possible in a moment, and then there's the unacceptable, right? Well, we certainly don't want to live in the unacceptable, but the ideal is often pitched as if it's just magically you can get there. And if you're not there, then, you know, something's wrong with you. I had in our church about 3 weeks ago, there's 5 teaching pastors. One couldn't be there that day, but 4 of us, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, were in a sense asked into a meeting by 2 African-American couples in our church, along with a white couple. The white couple, they had been interacting with these African-Americans. They came, and basically, to make a long story short, they are Trump-loving, conservative African-Americans. And our messaging so much in the last few months has been addressing the things that Oneya pointed out that many other pastors may not be addressing. But they called us to that tension, and they said, we just want to remind you that not every African-American thinks the way that on these different things. And so when you're pastoring a church like this with progressives and conservative Republicans that are actually, I mean, I've got white liberals and Black conservatives. I got Black, you've got this mix, and that's the realistic, practical day-to-day. How, like Christ, do you hold all those people in tension, right? Because again, it's Christ died with his, I like to say, he died out, he had his arm out for the Republicans and his arm out with the Democrats, and he's holding everybody together, right? And the blacks and the whites, rich, poor, whatever. And I think that is ultimately the task of peacemaking, is to bring people into tension, help them, in a sense, get comfortable with tension, learn to, even while we may disagree on methods, we don't doubt one another's hearts. These are very, very difficult, practical, pastoral questions that aren't solved, on a Twitter, somebody on Twitter saying, well, you should just do that. So again, there's ideal, there's unrealistic, but we're living in that tension of practical, realistic, moving the ball down the field, adjusting the game plan. We got blocked on that last play. We thought we were going 5 yards down the field. We got knocked back 3 yards. So how do you adjust in real time? Those are the complex issues of pastoring in this, and the nuance and the complexity. Again, these folks know it's not assimilation. Man, it is not assimilation, which is basically how everybody wants their diversity. They want it by assimilation. You check your culture at the door and embrace mine, right? So it's not. It's adaptive. It's accommodating. And lastly, I just say a voice that it's not really missing, but if I could add one more person to this conversation today, it'd be George Yancey. I would say, in my humble opinion, that George is one of the most nuanced, critical thinkers, sociologist for 25 years, good friend of Michael and Oneya. I think you know George as well. But he is one of the most nuanced, critical thinkers on this, been at it for 25 years, currently at Baylor. I'm glad to see, because he stepped away in his research and his writing a little bit from the race conversation over the last 5 years. He's been working with universities and looking at bias against Christians in the secular university. But I'm really happy to see George re-engaging on something that he has researched, written about, thought deeply about. But he is one that I would encourage people to read his blog post on Patheos. And he's a very challenging thinker, because he holds these tensions and nuance. And I love that, because it's not this or that. In our cancel culture, everything's this or that. And that's just not life. That's not realistic. So anyway, but again, Oneya and Michael, these guys, George, I've learned so much. I learned today. And Paul, thank you for your work and what you've been doing for many years, you and Derek Chin at Multnomah. I'm just honored to be a part of the conversation today.
And thank you, Mark. And again, that point of keeping things in tension and not going to confirmation bias or echo chambers, to stay in the conversation, that ain't easy in our day. And the cancel culture and everything being reduced to a tweet, it's all over the place, right? And so these are challenges we face. But again, you've heard the hope that my colleagues have here, and a willingness and a desire and a hunger, not to go into hype, but to live into that hope, to have that hunger that it's worth it. Really, it cannot be done alone. And I think you hear that. You sense the passion and you sense the desire for community. Mark knows that he couldn't do it alone. He never sought to do it alone. You know, he's doing it with our sister and brother here. He's doing it with a host of people. Oneya is not doing it alone, with a community of scholars and practitioners. And Michael is not doing it alone. It can't be done alone. The enemy would so sabotage if one tries to do this in isolation. It can't be done alone. It's a marathon race, not a sprint. And so I want to thank my colleagues. They mentioned George Yancey's work. I encourage viewers and listeners to read George Yancey's work, Oneya's work, Oneya Okuwobi. I'm so passionate right now. I'm excited about this conversation. Oneya Okuwobi. Sorry, did I say that correct that time? So Mark DeMaz, I got the accent right on his first name, Mark. And then Michael Emerson. Thank you all very much for joining us for this New Wine Tastings episode on the multi-ethnic church movement, past, present, and future. Colleagues, thank you very much. Blessings to you all and to our viewers and listeners as well. Thank you.